December 1941. The dawn fog hangs thick over the coast of Richmond, California. Somewhere beyond the mist, the rhythmic clang of steel against steel echoes like artillery in the distance. Sparks burst from the dark as welders crouch over vast metal plates, their torches carving light into the gloom. A massive hull looms overhead, gray, skeletal, and rising fast. It isn't a battleship, it isn't a cruiser, it's a cargo vessel, plain and functional. But it will soon carry the lifeblood of nations. Steam whistles shriek, cranes groan. Thousands of workers move as one. Men, women, immigrants, farmers turned riveters, all racing time itself. Their mission? Build a ship faster than the enemy can sink one. Far across the Atlantic in Berlin, a report lands on a wooden desk. German naval officers read in silence. Another American ship completed. In just days, not months. The numbers don't make sense, the logic collapses. For years, the U-boats had ruled the ocean. Now the Americans are building a new fleet faster than Germany can destroy it. The age of mass-produced war has begun. In the early years of the Second World War, the Atlantic Ocean became the most dangerous battlefield on Earth. There were no trenches, no front lines, only waves, steel, and the silent menace of submarines lurking below. By 1940, Britain stood alone against Hitler's expanding empire. France had fallen, Europe was burning, and across the Atlantic, the United States was still a neutral power, its factories roaring, its shipyards busy, but its soldiers not yet in uniform. For Britain, the war had become a matter of survival. Every bullet, every loaf of bread, every gallon of fuel had to cross the ocean. Convoys of merchant ships, slow, unarmed cargo vessels, sailed through the North Atlantic in long, vulnerable lines. They carried food, oil, ammunition, and tanks. Without them, Britain would starve. But the German Navy knew this too. The Kriegsmarine's U-boats, commanded by men like Karl Dönitz, stalked the ocean depths with ruthless precision. They called it the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign not of glory but of endurance and attrition. From bases in occupied France and Norway, the U-boats spread like wolves. They struck at night, surfacing among convoys, firing torpedoes, then vanishing back into the cold black water. By 1941, the results were catastrophic. Over 2,200 Allied merchant ships had been sent to the bottom. Entire convoys disappeared without a trace. Each loss meant fewer supplies, fewer weapons, fewer chances for Britain to hold the line. And with every sinking, Hitler's grip on Europe tightened. In London, Winston Churchill watched the figures rise. He later wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. It wasn't an exaggeration. If the Atlantic lifeline broke, Britain would fall, and with it, the hope of liberating Europe." The Royal Navy worked furiously to protect its convoys. Destroyers and corvettes formed defensive screens. Aircraft scouted the waves. Radar and sonar began to tip the balance. Yet, for every escort ship built, the Germans launched more submarines. The industrial math favored the hunters, not the hunted. By late 1941, even before America entered the war, the Allies faced a grim arithmetic. They were losing merchant ships faster than they could build them. A cargo vessel typically took 6 months to construct, time the Allies didn't have. In Washington, U.S. Navy planners and shipbuilders studied the reports coming from Britain. The numbers were staggering. Tons of cargo lost, ships destroyed, crews drowned. Every figure represented another blow to Allied survival. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America was suddenly thrust into a global war it had tried to avoid. Overnight, the United States became the arsenal of democracy. But even an arsenal needs ships to deliver its weapons. The Atlantic was bleeding steel faster than America could supply it. Something had to change. The war wasn't going to be won by heroism alone. It would be won by production, by factories and forges and the relentless rhythm of industry. But shipbuilding, as it was understood then, was slow, traditional, and meticulous. A craft, not an assembly line. The great shipyards of the world were designed to build one vessel at a time, with every rivet hammered by hand, every beam cut to measure. And yet, out on the American West Coast, an industrialist with no experience in shipbuilding looked at the problem differently. His name was Henry J. Kaiser, and he believed ships could be built like cars, fast, standardized, and in massive numbers. As German submarines prowled the Atlantic, Kaiser prepared to challenge centuries of shipbuilding tradition. Where others saw a crisis, he saw an engineering revolution waiting to happen, and that revolution was about to reshape the very tempo of war. By early 1942, the United States faced an impossible task: replace the tonnage lost in the Atlantic faster than the U-boats could destroy it. The math was merciless. In January alone, German submarines sank over 600,000 tons of Allied shipping. At that pace, Britain would be cut off in months. The U.S. Maritime Commission called for a new type of vessel: simple, cheap, fast to build, and capable of carrying the vital cargo that sustained armies and nations. It didn't need to be beautiful. It needed to float, haul, and survive. What emerged was a design known officially as the EC2SC1. To sailors and shipbuilders, it would be called something else: the Liberty Ship. It was a utilitarian masterpiece, 441 feet long, 10,000 tons fully loaded, with a speed of about 11 knots. Each carried enough fuel, munitions, or food to support entire divisions. It wasn't armored, it wasn't fast, but it could be built by the thousands. The design itself came from a British prototype, the Empire Liberty, which the Americans adapted for mass production. But the true revolution came not from blueprints but from process. Enter Henry J. Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship in his life. He was known for massive infrastructure projects, dams, bridges, and highways, but his genius lay in logistics, not ship design. Kaiser looked at traditional shipyards with their long construction times and slow, sequential labor, and decided to tear the entire system apart. In his mind, shipbuilding should work like an assembly line, just as Detroit built automobiles. Instead of crafting one ship start to finish, he divided the process into prefabricated sections. Entire hulls were cut into modular blocks, welded in separate workshops, and later joined together like pieces of an enormous steel puzzle. Kaiser's shipyards in Richmond, California and Portland, Oregon became cathedrals of industry. Day and night the docks roared. Welders replaced riveters using electric arcs to fuse steel faster than ever before. Cranes swung enormous panels into place with machine-like precision. To man this industrial army, Kaiser recruited across America. Farmers, clerks, and teenagers joined seasoned steelworkers. For the first time in U.S. history, women in large numbers entered heavy industry, the real Rosies behind the famous riveter. They learned fast, welding seams that stretched for miles, turning molten steel into the backbone of the Allied war effort. Shipbuilding had transformed from craftsmanship into choreography, tens of thousands of people moving in sync to a single national rhythm. Every yard worked to a strict schedule. Each day lost meant lives lost. In 1941, before the revolution, building a cargo ship took roughly 200 to 250 days. By 1942, under Kaiser's new methods, that number fell below 50. By 1943, some ships were launched in less than 2 weeks. German intelligence didn't believe it. Their naval analysts saw the reports, the numbers of hulls completed, and dismissed them as propaganda. No industrial system, they thought, could build ocean-going ships that fast. But it was real. And every Liberty ship launched was another nail in the coffin of the U-boat campaign. Each launch became a patriotic spectacle. Bands played, crowds cheered, and workers who had never seen the ocean watched their handiwork slide into it for the first time. It was more than steel. It was morale, faith made tangible in rivets and welds. In Washington, President Roosevelt called them the ships that will bring us victory. They weren't glamorous. They were slow, noisy, and often described as ugly ducklings. But to the Allied commanders watching their supplies finally reach the front, they were beautiful beyond measure. By mid-1943, production had reached a tempo never before imagined. The Atlantic, once a graveyard of ships, began to fill again with convoys so vast they stretched beyond the horizon. And while German U-boats hunted furiously for every merchant ship they destroyed, 5 new Liberty ships took its place. The war of endurance was shifting, from the depths of the ocean to the furnaces of American industry. And as this new fleet surged forward, the Germans began to realize that something far greater than any weapon was now arrayed against them: the industrial will of a nation. The Liberty ships were not born from naval academies or admiralty orders. They were built by ordinary Americans. In shipyards from California to Maine, over 700,000 civilians became the backbone of a wartime miracle. Many had never seen a ship before. Some had never touched a wrench. Yet within months they were welding hulls, shaping steel, and running cranes with military precision. The government called them essential workers. History would call them heroes. They worked around the clock, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Floodlights turned night into day. The pounding of hammers and the shriek of welders never stopped. For many, the shipyard became both home and battlefield. The slipways were never silent. But what happened in Portland, Oregon in November of that year would turn the industrial race into legend. The idea began as a test, a demonstration of what American industry could do when pushed beyond all expectation. Henry Kaiser's management wanted to prove that the process could be compressed even further. Not months, not weeks, days. The ship chosen for this challenge was the SS Robert E. Peary, named after the Arctic explorer who reached the North Pole. Her keel was laid on the morning of November 8, 1942, at the Kaiser Permanente Yard No. 2 in Portland. Normally, such a ceremony marked the beginning of a half-year effort. But this time the plan was to launch the ship before the week was out. The crews laughed at first, then they started working. The process unfolded like a military operation. 3 8-hour shifts worked continuously, totaling over 1,200 laborers rotating without pause. Prefabricated sections, bow, stern, midship panels, and superstructure had already been partially assembled in separate fabrication sheds. Welders moved in teams, working by blinding arcs of light that reflected off rain-slick steel. Cranes swung massive pre-cut blocks into place. Sparks cascaded like fireworks as seams were fused together. Riveters and pipe fitters followed behind, sealing joints and connecting the labyrinth of internal structures. Food was brought directly to the slipway. Coffee urns never cooled. Every clock on site was synchronized. Every tool counted. Day 1, the keel was complete. Day 2, the hull began to rise. By the 4th day, the entire ship, 441 feet of steel, stood fully assembled. At dawn on November 12th, with welding still hot to the touch, the ship slid down the ways into the Willamette River. The time, 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. She floated, perfectly balanced, seaworthy, complete. News spread faster than the ship itself. Across the United States, newspapers blared headlines of a 4-day ship. The feat defied every principle of traditional shipbuilding. President Roosevelt personally congratulated Kaiser's team. Photographs of the launch were sent to London, where Churchill reportedly smiled and remarked, "The Americans are truly the new shipwrights of the world." But the most dramatic reaction came from across the ocean, in Berlin. Within days, German intelligence intercepted the reports. Their analysts assumed it was Allied propaganda. The idea that a 10,000-ton cargo vessel could be built in less than a week seemed impossible. Absurd, even. Admiral Karl Donitz ordered his staff to verify the claim. The confirmation came from neutral sources in Sweden. The story was true. The Kriegsmarine's staff calculations showed a grim result. Even if every U-boat in service sank 1 Allied merchant vessel per patrol, the Americans could still outbuild them 5-1. For a navy that had built its strategy on strangling the enemy's logistics, this was a psychological disaster. In internal memos, German officers began referring to the American shipyards as Waffenfabriken des Ozeans, the weapons factories of the ocean. The U-boat captains at sea could sense it too. They still attacked with precision, still struck fear into the convoys. But the ocean seemed to refill itself overnight. For every plume of oil and debris that marked a ship destroyed, a new hull was already sliding into the water thousands of miles away. It was as if the Allies had found a way to turn time itself into a weapon. The Liberty ship miracle became more than an engineering record. It became a symbol of American willpower under fire, At the Portland shipyard, crowds gathered as the Robert E. Peary entered the water. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder, exhausted and covered in soot, their faces illuminated by floodlights and flashbulbs. When the ship's hull met the river, a cheer erupted that could be heard for miles. They had not only built a ship, and they had built proof. Proof that democracy could move with the precision of an army. Proof that free men and women could produce faster than dictators could destroy. And somewhere deep beneath the Atlantic, as German sonar operators listened to the endless pings of new convoys forming, the sound carried a message louder than any explosion. The tide had turned. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer the graveyard it had been. For 3 years it had swallowed ships by the hundreds, tankers, freighters, troop transports. The ocean littered with oil slicks and debris. But now the pattern was shifting. The Liberty ships were appearing faster than the U-boats could sink them. Convoys once thin and desperate now stretched from horizon to horizon. Each was escorted by new destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft carriers, supported by radar and sonar. But it was the sheer mass of shipping that changed everything. Every week, dozens of Liberty ships slipped into the Atlantic, their hulls painted gray, their decks stacked with cargo bound for war. They carried tanks for Patton's army, food for British civilians, fuel for Soviet tanks, the raw lifeblood of a global alliance. Even as U-boats prowled the ocean's depths, they were drowning in numbers. A submarine could destroy a convoy, but not a system, and the Liberty ship program had become a system, vast, rhythmic, unstoppable. Historians would later call it Black May, the month the U-boat fleet broke. After years of hunting with near impunity, the hunters became the hunted. Allied air patrols extended deep into the Atlantic using long-range B-24 Liberators. Convoy escorts armed with new radar and depth charges began tracking submarines before they could strike. And most importantly, the convoys themselves were growing too large, too frequent, too redundant to stop. For every freighter sunk, several more arrived to replace it. For every torpedo fired, another hull was being welded into shape in California, Oregon, or the Gulf Coast. In just 1 month, Germany lost 41 submarines, a quarter of its active fleet. Dönitz withdrew his forces from the North Atlantic in desperation. The Battle of the Atlantic, once the lifeline of German naval power, was effectively over. The Liberty ships had not fought that battle. They had outlasted it. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. In the age of total war, logistics were strategy. The Liberty ships didn't carry guns or armor, but their cargo fed armies, fueled bombers, and rebuilt nations in real time. In North Africa, Liberty ships enabled the Allied invasion to sustain itself across thousands of miles of desert. In Italy, they brought tanks and munitions through mined harbors. And in the Pacific, their design was adapted into victory ships, faster and more advanced successors carrying supplies for island campaigns against Japan. The oceans that had once separated nations were now assembly lines of steel and motion. Every ship was a factory of endurance, proof that wars could be won not only by tactics but by tempo. Even the German high command began to acknowledge the industrial defeat. In reports to Hitler, Dönitz warned that the enemy's shipbuilding capacity had rendered the blockade of the Atlantic impossible. He wrote bitterly, "The enemy builds ships faster than we can sink them. Their shipyards are the true front." And he was right. The true battlefield of 1943 was not fought in the Atlantic's gray waves. It was fought in the forges of Richmond, the cranes of Portland, and the sweat of workers who had turned labor into warfare. To many historians, the Liberty ship stands as a symbol of the moment America became the industrial leader of the modern world. It represented not just steel, but organization, belief, and will. When the SS Robert E. Peary launched in 4 days, it proved that no nation on earth could match America's manufacturing speed. When the 1,000th Liberty ship slid into the water in 1943, it proved that production had become a form of strategy. And when convoy losses finally fell below replacement levels, it proved something deeper, that the collective effort of free men and women could outbuild tyranny itself. By 1944, the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. The convoys ran nearly without interruption. The Liberty ships carried men and materiel to England for the greatest invasion in history, Operation Overlord. In the months before D-Day, they transported over 3 million tons of supplies and 1 million soldiers across the sea. When the invasion fleet sailed on June 6, 1944, Liberty ships stood among the massive armada, not as warships, but as lifelines. Their flat decks carried landing craft. Their holds stored rations, fuel, and ammunition. And as the beaches of Normandy erupted with gunfire, the gray silhouettes of Liberty ships anchored offshore, silent giants feeding the invasion that would free Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun as a struggle of survival. It ended as a triumph of production over destruction. The German Navy, once the master of the sea lanes, had been defeated not by superior tactics but by the raw, unrelenting force of American industry. And in every port from Liverpool to Le Havre, from Boston to Belfast, one sight became common: the broad bow of a Liberty ship, her name painted proudly on the side, her deck stacked high with the weight of victory. By mid-1944, the thunder of war had begun to shift eastward, toward France, toward the Pacific, toward the final stages of a global conflict that had consumed nations. But behind the front lines in ports and shipyards across 2 continents, the quiet miracle of the Liberty ship program was becoming clear. In less than 3 years, the United States had built over 2,700 Liberty ships, an average of 3 per day. They were not elegant. They were not beautiful, but they were everywhere. Women filled the ranks in unprecedented numbers. Mothers, teachers, and farmhands became welders, pipefitters, and foremen. They tied their hair in scarves, donned overalls, and proved that patriotism could wield a torch as skillfully as any man. Kaiser built child care centers beside his shipyards, ensuring mothers could work without fear for their families. He provided health plans and canteens, a small reflection of humanity amid the mechanized rush of war. Every worker knew the stakes. Every beam of steel carried the weight of soldiers waiting overseas. Each ship launched was one less convoy lost to the sea, one more chance for victory. And when the whistle blew and a new hull touched the water, the cheers from those docks weren't for glory, they were for survival. The miracle of the Liberty ships wasn't just manpower, it was method. Kaiser's team replaced the centuries-old practice of riveting with welding, a bold, controversial shift. Traditionalists claimed it would never work. Riveting, though slow, had built ships since the age of steam. But welding fused steel faster, stronger, and with fewer hands. Prefabrication was the second breakthrough. Rather than build ships piece by piece on a single slipway, entire sections were assembled in different workshops. A bow could be constructed while a stern was still being welded a mile away. When the time came, cranes hoisted these enormous blocks together, a 10,000-ton puzzle snapping into place. This system slashed build times dramatically. Each Liberty ship was made of 250,000 parts, all standardized. Every plate, valve, and beam could fit any ship of the class, allowing parts to move between factories like components of a car. The shipyards themselves became symbols of efficiency. At Richmond, 4 enormous yards sprawled across the waterfront, each dedicated to continuous production. Electric cranes swung overhead like clockwork arms. Locomotives ferried steel to assembly lines. What had once been a slow artisanal process became industrial choreography. And with every improvement, time fell away. By 1943, the average construction time had dropped to just 42 days per ship. In one extraordinary case, the SS Robert E. Peary was launched after only 4 days and 15 hours. A feat so unbelievable that newspapers compared it to magic. The Liberty ship program became a global statement that the United States had mastered not only technology but tempo, the speed of war. For the German Navy, the Liberty ships were an equation they couldn't solve. In 1940 and 1941, U-boat commanders had dominated the Atlantic. Convoys were slow, scattered, and easy prey. Each sinking sent a message of German superiority, proof that the ocean itself was under Hitler's control. But by 1943, those reports began to change. Where once a single U-boat could decimate an entire convoy, now convoys seemed endless. For every merchant ship destroyed, more appeared, faster than they could be sunk. German intelligence officers in Berlin read the figures with disbelief. American shipyards were producing 3 Liberty ships a day, an output that defied every expectation of wartime logistics. Admiral Donitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign, privately admitted that the industrial capacity of the United States had become the true enemy. The tone of radio intercepts from Allied convoys also shifted. Where once distress calls dominated the airwaves, now reports came of supplies arriving safely in Liverpool, Murmansk, and Casablanca. It was a quiet but decisive form of warfare, a victory measured not in battles won, but in ships that refused to stop coming. Inside the German Naval High Command, a chilling realization set in. The Allies were no longer trying to survive the Battle of the Atlantic. They were beginning to outproduce it. The shock was strategic, not emotional. The German war machine, built on precision and discipline, was now facing a different kind of weapon. Industrial chaos harnessed into order. Steel for steel, ship for ship, America was flooding the oceans faster than Germany could empty them. And as those gray hulls began to cover the seas, a silent understanding spread among German officers that the tide of war was beginning to turn, not with guns or torpedoes, but with welders' sparks on American soil. Warfare is often measured in battles and blood, but in the Second World War, victory was also measured in output. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that long before most generals did. When he spoke of America as the arsenal of democracy, it wasn't a metaphor. It was a directive, a national mobilization unlike anything in modern history. Roosevelt surrounded himself with industrial minds who thought not in terms of brigades or battalions, but in assembly lines and tonnage. Among them, Henry Kaiser stood out, not as a military man, but as a visionary builder. Kaiser's genius wasn't limited to welding steel. It lay in building systems. He reorganized the very rhythm of production, breaking down construction into thousands of small, repeatable tasks that anyone could learn. He believed people were the greatest resource, and that given purpose and tools they could outbuild any enemy. Under Roosevelt's backing, the U.S. Maritime Commission gave Kaiser the authority and the funds to expand at unprecedented scale. New shipyards sprang up overnight. Cities like Richmond and Portland transformed into industrial fortresses. Entire communities lived by the pulse of production. Each Liberty ship launched was more than a vessel. It was a statement of intent. To the Allies, it meant hope and endurance. To the Axis, it was a signal that America was no longer ramping up. It was unstoppable. As Roosevelt said in 1942, "We must outbuild the enemy, not merely fight him." And through the Liberty ship, that vision took physical form, one welded seam at a time. The Liberty ships became a kind of social mirror, a reflection of what the United States could become when every citizen played a part. They were not born of luxury or profit, but of necessity and shared duty. Every yard operated under fixed-price government contracts. There was no competition, only collaboration. The goal was not wealth, it was speed. Steel, labor, fuel, and design all funneled toward one single moral objective: keep the convoys alive. The economic impact rippled across the country. Factories in the Midwest forged engines and propellers. Rail lines carried parts west. Small towns emptied as workers flocked to the coast. In less than 2 years, shipbuilding had become the largest industrial employer in the nation. Yet the moral power of the program extended far beyond economics. It redefined patriotism. In an age before automation, human hands built every inch of those ships. Young men too old or too young for military service found purpose in the yards. Women who had been told they couldn't proved that they could, and did. Immigrants and minorities, long excluded from industry, joined the war effort shoulder to shoulder. The Liberty ship symbolized equality through labor. Each one bore a name, usually that of an American pioneer, reformer, or hero. From Patrick Henry to Harriet Tubman, from Paul Revere to Frederick Douglass. Every hull carried a fragment of national memory across the sea. To many, these names meant more than steel tonnage. They meant identity, proof that democracy itself had gone to war. The morale this created was incalculable. The more ships launched, the louder the message became, that tyranny might win battles, but freedom could build faster. By mid-1943, the effects of the Liberty ship fleet were being felt across every theater of war. Convoys that once sailed under constant threat now traveled with growing confidence. Allied planners began to think not in terms of what could be sent across the Atlantic, but how much more could be sent. The impact reached far beyond Britain. In November 1942, during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, Liberty ships carried the majority of the supplies, vehicles, and men. Over 100 of them took part, forming the logistical backbone of an amphibious assault spanning 2,000 miles. As the war expanded, the Liberty ships became the arteries of Allied movement. They ferried tanks to Tunisia, munitions to Sicily and food to starving civilians in liberated France. They supplied the Red Army through the icy Murmansk route, enduring Arctic storms and Luftwaffe attacks to keep the Eastern Front alive. Their simplicity was their strength. If one ship was damaged, it could be repaired quickly. If one was sunk, it was immediately replaced. And because their crews were often merchant mariners rather than naval personnel, the U.S. Navy could focus its warships on combat while civilians kept the lifeline open. German U-boats continued to inflict losses, but the scale of Allied shipping had surpassed the point of vulnerability. Where once the sinking of 10 ships crippled a convoy, now it barely made a dent. Tactically, the Liberty ship fleet turned logistics from a weakness into a weapon. It enabled the D-Day invasion, sustained the Italian campaign, and maintained the global supply web that connected the Allies from Alaska to Australia. Every bullet fired in Normandy, every ration delivered in North Africa, every tank rolling into Berlin, and all had, at some point, passed through the steel hull of a Liberty ship. And deep within the German Navy, the realization grew grimly clear. They weren't just fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting factories. By late 1942, the Liberty ship program was no longer an experiment. It was an avalanche. Each shipyard had mastered its rhythm. Steel arrived by the hour. Crews rotated in perfect sequence. From Arctic convoys to Murmansk to the tropical harbors of the South Pacific, Liberty ships carried everything the Allies needed to win. Each one could haul 10,000 tons of cargo, tanks, aircraft parts, rations, munitions, and keep moving despite ice, torpedoes, or storms. The effect on the Allied war machine was staggering. The logistical nightmare that had crippled campaigns in 1940 and 1941 was gone. Where once there had been shortage, now there was abundance. And that abundance was what allowed the Allies to think bigger, to plan invasions, to sustain multiple fronts, to fight across oceans. Every major operation after 1943, from the landings in Sicily to D-Day and beyond, relied on the Liberty ship's steady pulse of supply. Even the Red Army's advance across Eastern Europe was fueled in part by Liberty ships carrying American trucks, food, and fuel through the Persian corridor. The ripple effect was global. The shipyards that built them became engines of local economies. Entire cities, Richmond, Portland, Mobile, Baltimore, were transformed overnight. They swelled with workers from every background: farmers from Oklahoma, miners from Appalachia, women from across the Midwest, and African Americans escaping the segregated South for industrial opportunity. Inside those shipyards, the lines of class and gender blurred. It wasn't equality, not yet, but it was a start. Women in coveralls welded steel beside men who had once doubted them. Black workers joined unions that had never welcomed them before, and for the first time, the American industrial worker became a central figure in the story of victory. The Liberty ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a social revolution encased in steel. When the German High Command reviewed the numbers in 1944, disbelief gave way to resignation. Germany's entire shipbuilding industry, under the most centralized war economy in history, could not match even a fraction of America's output. The United States had achieved something far beyond its pre-war imagination, a fully synchronized system where industry, government, and labor functioned as one. It was the embodiment of Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy. Factories in the heartland built engines and propellers. Steel mills in Pennsylvania rolled out plates. Shipyards on both coasts assembled hulls in sections, welded instead of riveted. A radical innovation that sped construction tenfold. Every step was timed, measured, perfected. And behind every torch, every rivet, stood an individual whose labor, multiplied by millions, became a weapon in itself. The result was a phenomenon historians still call the victory of scale. Not one decisive battle, not one brilliant general, but the triumph of mass, organization, and will. And when the last Liberty ship launched in 1945, the world had changed. The war was nearing its end. But the systems built to fight it, the industrial networks, the labor force, the technological processes, would continue to shape the world for decades. The Liberty ships had done more than supply the war. They had built the foundation for modern global logistics, for a new age of international trade, and for the idea that democracy could outproduce dictatorship. As the guns of Europe began to fall silent, the men and women who had forged that victory returned home. to families, to quiet streets, to ordinary lives. But in every harbor, the gray silhouettes of Liberty ships still rocked gently against their moorings, reminders that even in the darkest years, human determination had built its own light. And yet the story didn't end there, because what followed after victory revealed the lasting legacy and irony of the Liberty ship fleet, a fleet that won a war, then had to find a new purpose in peace. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the oceans changed character once again. Convoys no longer sailed in fear. The endless escort lines and blacked-out ships gave way to calm waters and open decks. But for the thousands of Liberty ships that had carried the war on their backs, peace presented a new question. What now? They had been built for speed, not longevity. Designed to last 5 years at most, few were expected to see another decade. Yet, in the strange calm after victory, the world still needed them. Europe was in ruins. Cities lay shattered, ports destroyed, railways twisted by bombs. And once again, the Liberty ships sailed. This time not with weapons, but with food, medicine, and hope. Under the Marshall Plan, hundreds of Liberty ships carried cargoes of wheat, machinery, and construction materials across the Atlantic to rebuild Europe. Their gray hulls, once symbols of war, became vessels of recovery. In Asia, they transported relief supplies to Japan and the Philippines. In Africa and the Middle East, they carried industrial goods to emerging economies. Even the Soviet Union continued to use dozens of them for trade and transport, long after the war's end. Some were sold to private companies, renamed, repainted, and repurposed into cargo ships, for a world suddenly hungry for commerce. Others were laid up in reserve fleets, long rows of rusting hulls anchored in quiet rivers from Virginia to California. They became ghost fleets, sleeping monuments to an industrial miracle. Most Liberty ships did not survive the following decades. Worn by years of hard service, many were scrapped in the 1950s and 1960s, replaced by newer, faster vessels. But a few were spared. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, built in 1943 at the New England Shipbuilding Corporation in Maine, became one of the most famous survivors. After serving in the D-Day landings, she was preserved by volunteers and later restored to full operation. In 1994, she crossed the Atlantic once again to take part in the 50th anniversary of the Normandy invasion. Her engines, still powered by the same triple expansion steam system of the 1940s, throbbed back to life after half a century, and as she entered the harbor of Cherbourg, her whistle echoing through the gray morning air, French veterans wept. The Liberty ship had come home, not as a weapon but as a memory. The SS John W. Brown followed a similar path, restored in Baltimore as a living museum. Together, these ships stand today as floating classrooms, teaching new generations what it meant to fight a war not just with bullets, but with blueprints and belief, industrial lessons and lasting legacy. The Liberty ship program left behind more than hulls in history. It transformed how the world thought about manufacturing itself. The concept of modular construction, perfected during the program, became a cornerstone of post-war industry, used in everything from skyscrapers to aircraft to automobiles. The management methods pioneered by Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards became templates for modern production systems. And the social changes sparked on the factory floor, the inclusion of women and minorities in industrial labor, planted seeds that would grow into later civil rights and gender equality movements. The Liberty ships had done more than carry goods. They had carried change. A symbol recast for Germany, the Liberty ships represented the moment the illusion of invincibility shattered. Proof that industrial capacity could crush even the most disciplined war machine. For America, they became the symbol of a nation discovering its own strength, the power of coordination, of collective effort, of simple ideas executed at impossible scale. And for the world, they were a reminder that progress itself could be a weapon, that ingenuity, not ideology, could determine the fate of nations. By the time the last operational Liberty ship was retired in the early 1970s, their legacy had outgrown the war that created them. The global shipping industry they helped establish would fuel the next era of globalization, connecting continents in trade rather than conflict. But in every museum that preserves their rusted hulls, in every photograph of those vast shipyards, one truth remains. The Liberty ship was not just built of steel. It was built of urgency, courage, and collective will, the qualities that define a civilization when it's tested to its limits. And as the last waves roll against their aging bows, their story whispers still, of a time when humanity learned that victory could be forged not just by armies, but by hands of ordinary people. The Liberty ship was never meant to be remembered. It wasn't beautiful or heroic or even designed to last. It was made to exist and to serve, to move, to deliver, and then to vanish beneath the tides of history. But sometimes the simplest creations carry the deepest truths. In the age of grand strategies and terrible weapons, victory did not come from brilliance alone. It came from rhythm, from the endless hammering of steel, from the shift whistles at dawn, from millions of hands that refused to stop. Every weld, every rivet, every piece of cargo was a statement that freedom could be built faster than tyranny could destroy it. The Liberty ship became more than a vessel of war. It became the heartbeat of democracy under fire. It proved that courage was not only found on battlefields, but in the shipyards, in the factories, in the quiet endurance of those who built without glory. When the world looks back on the Second World War, it often remembers the battles, the generals, the machines of destruction. But beneath all of that lies the unspoken engine, the logistical miracle that made victory possible. And in that story, the Liberty ship stands alone, a vessel born from fear, refined by necessity, and immortalized by the idea that human effort, multiplied by unity, can change the course of history. Today, the few surviving Liberty ships float silently in harbors, their decks open to the sun, their paint worn by time. Visitors walk their narrow corridors, touching cold metal once alive with heat and motion.